The wind didn't just shift, it turned. It came down from the north sharp and dry like a razor blade dragged across the throat of the valley. It was a wind that carried warnings. Sterling Hale stood by the broken fence of his orchard. The wood of a rotted post was a weapon in his hand, but his eyes were fixed on the tree line. Something was wrong. The birds knew it first. They exploded from the canopy in a screaming black vortex, a cyclone of feathers and panic that wheeled over the apple rows before the bruised twilight swallowed them whole. He waited. He listened. Not for the familiar sounds of the wild, not for coyotes or deer or the groan of old wire. This was a different sound. It was the sound of silence. A quiet so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the crack of a gunshot. Sterling's hand drifted to the inside of his wool coat. The cold, heavy comfort of a small pistol rested there, a ghost from an older life, a life before the apple harvest, before the cider contracts, before he'd tried to bury himself in 500 acres of dirt and trees. But he didn't draw the weapon. Not yet. He pushed through the tall, dead grass, his boots finding the dirt path that led down to the south gate. The gate he hadn't used in months. And that's when he saw her. She was clinging to the rusted bars, a tiny thing, no older than 7. Her fingers were like pale twigs wrapped around the cold iron. Her hair was a tangled mat of dust and leaves, and her feet were bare on the sharp gravel, but she didn't seem to feel it. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even scared. She just stared at him with eyes that were terrifyingly empty. Eyes that had seen too much and forgotten how to feel anything at all. Sterling stopped. The orchard behind him seemed to sigh, the leaves whispering secrets he couldn't understand. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was steady, a rock in the middle of a churning river. She didn't answer. She didn't even blink. She was hollow, like a bell that had been cracked and could no longer ring. Sterling Hale was not a man who startled easily. Not after the things he'd done. Not after the wars, the boardrooms, the screaming headlines, and the cold, quiet courtrooms. He'd built this place as a fortress against the world, a place to entomb the man he used to be. People didn't just find this estate, and they sure as hell didn't just send their children. He reached into his pocket again, passed the pistol, and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in linen. It was the end of a cinnamon scone from breakfast. Hard now, but it was something. He took a step forward, placed it on a wooden crate by the gate, and then stepped back. He folded his arms. He waited. The girl's eyes flickered from him to the scone, a tiny spark in the emptiness. Then she moved. Her steps were silent, a ghost in the twilight. She looked left, then right, the practiced caution of an animal that knows every gift is a trap. She unwrapped the linen with a strange reverence, and then she began to eat. Not fast. She took small, deliberate bites, chewing each one slowly, as if she were teaching her own body the mechanics of survival. When she was done, she licked every last crumb from her fingers, then folded the linen cloth neatly and placed it back on the crate. She stepped back to the gate, wrapped her fingers around the bars, and resumed her vigil. He saw it then. A bruise, dark and ugly, half hidden beneath her jaw. The hem of her dress was shredded and smeared with something that wasn't mud. It was darker. "Where are your folks?" he asked. Still nothing, but her grip on the gate tightened, and for a single shattering moment, he thought she would finally break. She didn't. Her spine was made of something stronger than steel. Sterling took a slow breath and turned, walking back toward the massive stone house that loomed over the orchard. He didn't look back. He knew she was watching. On the porch, his estate manager, Mr. Carver, was waiting with a ledger. Carver was a man of few words and fewer emotions, which was why Sterling kept him. "Girl," Sterling said, "Southgate, get her a bowl of stew and a blanket." "Should I call the sheriff, sir?" Carver asked, his pen hovering over the page. Sterling looked out into the gathering dark. "No," he said. "Not yet." But by the time the first stars had pricked the black velvet of the sky, she was gone. Carver reported she'd eaten the soup, whispered a single hoarse "thank you," and vanished back into the woods, leaving the blanket folded perfectly on the crate. No name, no story, just a ghost who knew her manners. Sterling stared into the fire that night, the flames dancing in his eyes, and a restlessness he hadn't felt in a decade crawled under his skin. He knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The next morning the world was brittle with frost. Sterling stood at the same spot by the fence, watching the sun bleed over the hills. The gate was empty. The crate was empty. The woods were silent. But something felt different now. Something was incomplete. A loose thread had appeared in the tightly woven tapestry of his isolation. He stayed there for a long time, long after the harvest crews had started their day, a cold feeling coiling in his gut. 3 nights later, she came back. This time, she wasn't at the gate. This time, she wasn't alone. And this time, she knocked on his door. The knock was precise. 3 sharp raps against the heavy oak of the side entrance, the one reserved for business. It echoed through the cavernous hall of the main house, a sound so out of place it felt like a gunshot. Sterling looked up from his armchair. A worn journal lay open on his lap, its pages filled with numbers and charts, the language of his old life. He hadn't been reading it. He'd been listening, waiting. Mr. Carver appeared in the doorway, his usually placid face etched with a flicker of something Sterling couldn't quite read. Surprise or concern? "She's back, sir," Carver said, his voice low. Sterling didn't have to ask who. He felt it in the air. "She has her mother with her," Carver added. "They are on the front step." Sterling stood, not with the slow movements of a farmer, but with the decisive energy of a predator. He buttoned his cardigan, a pointless gesture of civilization, and walked toward the grand entryway. His boots were silent on the polished floorboards. He was a ghost in his own house. When he opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of dying leaves and smoke. The girl, Willer, was there, just as he knew she would be. Her hands were lost in the sleeves of a sweater that swallowed her whole, but her eyes were the same, steady, ancient, and unflinching. Beside her stood a woman. She was thin, all sharp angles and hard lines, with a face that had once been beautiful, but was now worn down by 1,000 sleepless nights and 1,000,000 miles of running. Her coat was ripped at the shoulder. Her shoes were 2 different shades of brown. "Mr. Hale?" the woman said. Her voice was sandpaper, rough and tired, but there was no weakness in it. It was the voice of a woman who expected the world to say no. "I'm Grace," she said, her hand resting on the girl's shoulder, a gesture of protection or ownership. "This is Willer. We're not looking for a handout. We're just looking for a place to stop." Sterling didn't speak. He took them in, every detail. The faint, fading bruise just under Grace's collar, a mirror of the one on her daughter. The way her fingers twitched, ready to flee. The way Willer pressed against her mother's leg, an anchor in a storm. He wasn't just looking at a mother and child. He was reading a story, and the story was written in scars and fear. "Are you hungry?" was all he asked. Grace gave a single, sharp nod. "We'll work for it." He looked past them to Carver, who was hovering in the hall. "Winery still short-staffed in bottling?" Carver's expression was unreadable. "Yes, sir, since October." "Put her on the line," Sterling commanded, "and get the east cottage opened up. Light a fire." He stepped back, holding the door open. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement. Grace hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped over the threshold. Willer followed, her small eyes darting up to his face for just a moment. There was no gratitude there, just a quiet assessment. He led them not to the grand dining room, but to a small, simple table near the warmth of the kitchen. Carver brought bowls of thick stew and slabs of cornbread. Willer stared at the food with the same intensity she'd shown the scone, as if it might be an illusion. Grace waited, her back ramrod straight, until her daughter had taken the first bite. Sterling watched them from the shadows, a silent observer. He saw the pride in Grace's posture, a fortress she had built around her exhaustion. He saw the way Willer's toes curled under the chair, as if she were still standing on cold, hard ground. This wasn't just a family in need. This was something else. They moved with a discipline, a quiet understanding, that spoke of a life lived by a strict set of rules he didn't yet understand. After they had eaten, Carver returned. "The cottage is ready, sir. Stocked and warm." Grace stood immediately. "Thank you." Sterling finally met her gaze. The first real eye contact since she'd arrived. "Work starts at 7. Reuben runs the bottling floor. He'll show you." "I'll be there," she said, her chin high. Carver led them out, their figures swallowed by the darkness, lit only by the amber lanterns that lined the stone path. Sterling remained at the table. He didn't know why he'd done it, why he had breached the walls he'd spent years building. But as he looked at the 2 empty bowls on the table, a cold certainty washed over him. He hadn't invited them in. They had been sent, and he was starting to think he knew why. He rose before dawn, a habit from his old life that refused to die. From a window on the second floor he saw it, a thin gray curl of smoke rising from the chimney of the east cottage. A sign of life, a flag planted on his territory, and it stirred something deep in his chest, a dormant beast he thought he'd starved to death long ago. By the time he was downstairs, coffee in hand, Willer was already outside. She stood by the stable fence, her small figure silhouetted against the rising sun. She wasn't touching anything. She was just watching the mist burn off the vineyard. She heard his footsteps on the porch and turned, her expression as blank as a clean slate. "Sleep all right?" he asked. She gave a small shrug. "It was warm." "That's something," he replied, sipping his coffee. Her eyes, old and knowing, scanned the endless rows of apple trees. "You live here all alone?" "I do," he said. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a complex theory she'd been working on. Then she hit him with it. "Why did you give me that bread?" Sterling paused. The question was too direct, too simple. It cut through all the layers of his solitude. "You looked like you needed it." "Lots of people need things," she said, her voice a tiny whisper. No one else stopped. "Maybe they weren't looking close enough," he said, the words feeling strange and foreign in his own mouth. She didn't reply. She just sat down on the bottom step of the porch, her bare feet dangling just above the frosted ground. She was a small thing, but she wasn't fragile. There was a coiled strength in her stillness, a defiance that wasn't learned in a happy home. It was forged in fire. Sterling didn't linger. The winery was waiting. The fences needed checking. The world kept turning. But as he walked away, he glanced back over his shoulder. Willer was still there, a tiny, unmovable object, watching his every move. And deep in the fortress of his chest, Sterling Hale felt the first crack appear in the stone. He didn't know who this girl was, or what her silent mother was running from. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was no longer alone. And the silence he had cultivated for so long was about to be shattered. 3 days. It had been 3 days, and the entire ecosystem of the estate had begun to warp around them. The east cottage no longer smelled of dust and disuse. It smelled of soap and wood smoke and something else, something that felt dangerously like home. Grace was a machine. She rose before the sun, her shadow moving silently through the pre-dawn gloom. She was on the bottling line before Reuben, the floor manager, had even brewed his morning coffee. She didn't talk. She didn't complain. She just worked, her movements efficient and precise, stacking crates and wiping down machinery with a focus that was almost unnerving. "She works," Reuben had told Sterling, his voice a mixture of awe and suspicion. "Like she's trying to erase something." Sterling had just nodded and walked away. He knew that kind of work. It wasn't about earning a wage. It was about building a wall, brick by painful brick, between who you are now and who you used to be. He saw it himself that morning. As he made his usual patrol past the cottage, he caught a flash of movement in the vineyard. It was Willer, her bare feet flying over the damp earth, chasing the fat orange barn cat. She wasn't laughing, not out loud, but the rigid tension that had encased her like a suit of armor was gone. Her steps were light. Her eyes weren't scanning for threats anymore. They were following butterflies. Sterling paused, his hand resting on the cold iron of the gate, and he watched her for a beat too long. He felt like an intruder. Back in the main house, Carver was waiting with the coffee, his face a perfect mask of professional indifference. "She's kept to the schedule precisely," Carver reported, his voice crisp. "Reuben says she's more reliable than men he's employed for a decade." "She said she would be," Sterling said, taking the mug. Carver's eyebrow arched a single questioning millimeter. "And you believed her, sir?" "I believe in what people do," Sterling said, his eyes drifting back to the window. "Not what they say." He took a sip. "The girl seems to be settling." "Children are resilient," Carver noted. "They learn to recognize safety, even if they don't yet understand the concept of trust." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Was Carver warning him, or was he simply stating a fact? With Carver, it was impossible to tell. Later that afternoon, Grace appeared at the back entrance of the main house. She didn't knock. She just stood there, a silent sentinel, until one of the kitchen staff noticed her. Carver was summoned. "Is Mr. Hale available?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Carver led her to the study. She moved through the opulent house like a phantom, her eyes taking in everything but touching nothing. She was a guest in a world she didn't belong to, and she knew it. Sterling was by the fire, staring into the flames. No book, no ledger, just him and his thoughts. "You needed something?" he asked without turning. She hesitated, her hands twisting the fabric of her worn coat. "Wheeler. She found an old toolbox by the north shed. It's rusted shut. She said it might be yours." Sterling turned slowly. He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate pride in her eyes. "You came all this way to tell me about a rusted box?" Her jaw tightened. "I don't want her thinking it's okay to take things that aren't ours. We don't keep what we don't earn." There it was again, that rigid, unbreakable code. It wasn't about a toolbox. It was about a principle. He stood and walked to the massive window that overlooked the vineyard, the rows of vines stretching out like golden veins on the hillside. "Do you like it here?" he asked, the question catching them both off guard. Her answer was instant and sharp. "I didn't come here to like it. I came here to stop looking over my shoulder." He nodded slowly. "And have you?" "Not yet," she whispered, the word hanging in the air like a ghost. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "I built this place to disappear," he said, his voice rough. "I never thought someone else would be looking for the same thing." Grace paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Maybe," she said, her back still to him. "We weren't looking for you. Maybe we were just looking for a place that didn't have any ghosts." And then she was gone. That night, the wind howled, rattling the windows and tearing at the leaves. Sterling did his evening patrol, his boots crunching on the gravel path. But this time, he found himself drawn to the east cottage. A single lamp cast a warm, golden glow from the window. He could see their silhouettes inside, two shadows moving in a slow, quiet dance of domesticity. He saw Grace stirring a pot on the stove. He saw Willer at the small table, a piece of charcoal in her hand, drawing on a scrap of a paper bag. He stood there in the darkness, hidden by the branches of a gnarled apple tree, and he watched them. He was a spy in his own kingdom, and he felt a profound and unsettling sense of trespass. He didn't know their secrets. He didn't know the name of the man, or the town, or the life they had fled. But he knew, with a gut-deep certainty, that their ghosts had followed them here. And soon, they would be knocking on his door. The next morning, before the sun had even kissed the horizon, Grace found a package on her doorstep. It wasn't wrapped. It was just a small brown paper bag. Inside, she found spools of fresh thread in 3 different colors, a card of polished buttons, and a small, sharp pair of sewing shears. Tucked inside was a note, written in a neat, precise hand. If you're going to keep fixing things, you might as well have the right tools. Grace folded the note and put it in her pocket. She looked out across the frost-covered orchard toward the big stone house, silent and imposing in the morning mist. Something had shifted. A silent transaction had taken place, and she knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that they were no longer just passing through. They were caught. Sterling Hale despised going into town. He used to know every street in Hudson Grove, every crooked sidewalk, every shopkeeper by name. That was before the money, before the headlines, before the quiet, screaming retreat from a world that had tried to devour him whole. Now, the town felt like a cage. The faces of the people were a blur of polite nods and curious stares, their minds filled with whispers of the man who had bought the old Callaway estate and turned it into a fortress. But the cider press was down 2 valves, and Reuben was getting agitated about cask lids. So he hitched the cart, made a list, and drove into the belly of the beast as the sun was just beginning to burn the fog off the valley floor. The feed store was easy. The hardware shop was quiet. He moved like a shadow, paying in cash, his interactions brief and sterile. He was a ghost haunting the edges of their world. It happened at the general store, the one place you couldn't avoid if you wanted flour and salt. He'd just heaved a heavy crate onto the worn wooden counter when he heard the voice. It was a lazy, confident drawl, the kind of voice a predator uses when it's trying to sound like a house cat. "Mornin', Vernon. Looking for someone," the man said, his shadow falling across the porch steps. "Woman. Blonde, kinda thin. Real quiet type. Got a little girl with her. 'Bout so high." Sterling's blood went cold. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. He knew that tone, the practiced ease, the casual hunt. Vernon, the shopkeeper, a man whose family had run this store for 100 years, scratched his grizzled beard. "Can't say that I have. Lot of folks passing through this time of year for the harvest." The man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, they ain't passing through. They're hidin'. That's the kind of thing a man remembers." Sterling's hand clenched around the crate. He could feel the grain of the wood biting into his palm. He had a choice. Turn around, face him, and blow this whole thing wide open, or stay invisible. "Want me to bag that up for you, Mr. Hale?" Vernon asked, his eyes flicking nervously between Sterling and the man on the porch. "No," Sterling said, his voice a low growl. "I'll take it as is." He paid, his movements stiff and controlled. He lifted the heavy crate and walked out onto the porch, right past him. He got a good look then, tall, clean-shaven, with a dark hat that was too new and boots that had never seen a day of real work. The man's eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, followed him. There was a flicker of something in them, not recognition, curiosity. The look a wolf gives a sheepdog, wondering if it will fight. Sterling didn't look back. He loaded the supplies, his mind racing. He didn't go to the bakery. He didn't get the kerosene. He just drove, the cart rattling over the uneven road, the peaceful silence of his estate suddenly feeling fragile, like a thin sheet of glass about to be shattered. When he pulled up to the barn, Grace was there, sorting apples. She saw his face, the hard set of his jaw, and she knew. She dropped the crate she was holding and met him halfway. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, at the way the sun caught the gold in her hair, the same blonde hair the man had described. "Man in town," he said, his voice flat, asking questions about a woman and a little girl. Her face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. Was he tall, brown vest, black hat? Sterling's gut clenched. That's the one. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her training, whatever it was, took over. Her spine straightened, and her eyes went hard. "That's one of them," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "One of his brothers." He didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. The terror in her eyes was answer enough. "You think they followed you?" "I don't know how," she said, her gaze darting towards the cottage where Willer was playing. "I was so careful, but if he's here sniffing around, it won't be long." He studied her, this woman who was a stranger, this woman who had brought a war to his doorstep. He saw the fighter in her, the survivor, and he made a decision that would change everything. "Do you trust me to handle this?" he asked. Grace looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something, anything. An answer, a promise. "You let us stay," she said, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "That's more than anyone else has ever done. I trust what that means." That night, Sterling didn't sit by the fire. He sat on the front porch, his rifle resting across his lap, its cold steel a familiar comfort. The orchard was dark and quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land anymore. He was protecting the flicker of life in the cottage window, the sound of a little girl humming, the presence of a woman who had nowhere else to run. He didn't know her story. He didn't know her real name. But he knew one thing. The man in the black hat had made a fatal mistake. He had come to the one place on earth where the ghosts were bigger and meaner than he was. And Sterling Hale was about to introduce them. The quiet that fell over the estate was worse than any noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. For 2 days, the world held its breath. Grace became a ghost inside the cottage, keeping Willer close, the curtains drawn tight. Willer, with the uncanny wisdom of a child who has known too much fear, didn't ask why. She just stayed near her mother, her drawings becoming darker. The houses she sketched now had bars on the windows. Sterling moved with a grim purpose. He walked the perimeter of his land not once, but 3 times a day. He wasn't just checking fences. He was mapping out sight lines, planning kill zones. The farmer was gone. The soldier had returned. He cleaned his rifle each night, the scent of oil and steel filling the grand house, a smell that felt more like home than the potpourri Carver insisted on. Carver watched him, his face an impassive mask. "Should I inform the men to be on alert, sir?" he asked one morning, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "No," Sterling said. "This isn't their fight. If it comes, it will come for me." The unspoken truth hung between them. It had already come for him. On the 3rd morning, Grace found him in the workshop, sharpening an axe with long, steady strokes. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "If it comes to it," she said, her voice startlingly clear in the silence, "I can shoot." Sterling didn't stop his work. He just looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He was surprised not by the words, but by the utter lack of fear in her voice. This wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. "Ever had to?" She gave a single, sharp nod. "Once, on a man bigger than you. Didn't kill him, but he stopped." He grunted, a sound of grim approval. He wiped the blade on a rag, the edge now keen enough to shave with. "There's a 12-gauge shotgun under the bed in your cottage," he said, his voice low. "It's old, but it's reliable. Point it at the center of a man's chest, and it will do the job." She didn't thank him. They were past that. This was an alliance, forged in desperation and sealed with the promise of violence. That afternoon, a strange thing happened. Willer, who had been a shadow for days, followed him to the barn. She didn't speak, just watched him as he moved through his chores, her old eyes taking in every detail. As he leaned into the mule's stall, whispering a quiet word, she finally spoke. "Did you ever have a little girl?" she asked, her voice so small he almost missed it. Sterling froze, his hand resting on the mule's powerful neck. The question hit him like a physical blow. "No," he said, his voice rough. "Just a brother, once." "You're nice," Willer said simply. "You should have. He didn't know what to say. The innocent words of a child had cut through years of armor. He just handed her a scoop of grain and watched her scatter it for the chickens, her small face serious and intent. Later that evening, as Grace sat by the fire mending a tear in one of Willer's dresses, the little girl was drawing again. When she was finished, she held it up. It was a picture of the main house and the cottage, with thick plumes of smoke rising from both chimneys, their trails intertwining in the sky. A fragile peace settled over them, the calm before the storm. But as Sterling sat in his armchair, the rifle leaning against the wall beside him, he knew it was a lie. The man in the black hat wasn't gone. He was out there, in the darkness, watching, waiting. And Sterling knew that this quiet, broken family he had taken in was not a weakness. They were his line in the sand, and he would burn the whole world down before he let anyone cross it. The wind was a living thing that night, a restless predator prowling the edges of the orchard. It clawed at the roof and whispered threats through the keyholes. Sterling sat on the porch steps, the cold seeping into his bones, but he didn't feel it. He was watching the light in the cottage window, a tiny beacon of defiance against the oppressive dark. Inside, Grace was moving with a quiet desperation. She was baking. Not for hunger, but for something else, to fill the silence, to fight the fear with the smell of cinnamon and yeast. A small tin of still-warm scones had appeared by the barn door that morning, a silent offering, a communion between two strangers bracing for the same war. Willer had retreated deeper into herself. Her humming had stopped, replaced by a watchful stillness that was more unnerving than any cry. "You think he'll come tonight?" Grace asked later, standing in the doorway of the main house. She held a mug of tea, but her hand was trembling so hard the liquid sloshed over the rim. Sterling didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the black, churning tree line. "His kind doesn't like the dark," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They like an audience. They like the sun on their victim's face, but he's close. I can feel him." "He never gives up," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Neither do I," Sterling replied. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise carved in stone. The hours crawled by, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a hammer blow against the silence. Grace eventually drifted into a fitful sleep in a chair across from him, her face a pale mask of exhaustion. Willer's soft, even breaths from the other room were the only peaceful sound in the entire world. Then he heard it. A single, deliberate crunch. Not an animal, not the wind. It was the sound of a boot on frozen ground. Sterling was on his feet in an instant, the shotgun materializing in his hands as if it were an extension of his own arm. He was silent, a predator in his own right. He cracked the heavy oak door just enough to peer into the inky blackness. A figure, a shadow, moving with liquid grace near the barn, using the ancient apple trees as cover. It was him, the man from town. He was scouting, measuring, assessing the fortress. Sterling brought the shotgun to his shoulder, the cold stock pressing against his cheek. He centered the sight on the man's chest, his finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it. Right now. One blast, and the ghosts would be gone. But the figure melted back into the woods, swallowed by the night as if he were never there. Sterling lowered the gun, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He hadn't pulled the trigger. Why? Was it mercy? Or was it something else? A cold, calculating part of his brain, the part he'd tried to bury, knew that a body on his property would bring lawmen, questions, and an end to his solitude. This had to be handled differently. This wasn't a fight of brute force. It was a chess match. He didn't sleep. At dawn, he was out in the woods, tracking the prints. They were faint, but the man had been careless, arrogant. Sterling followed them to a small hidden encampment just beyond his property line. A bedroll, the remains of a small fire, and something else. A small leather-bound notebook dropped in the dirt. He picked it up. Inside were not names, but numbers, dates, financial figures. It wasn't a hitman's journal. It looked like a ledger, and near the back, a name, circled several times. Alistair Finch. The name hit Sterling like a freight train. Alistair Finch, a name from his old life. A name he had personally sent to a federal prison for racketeering and fraud. A name that belonged to one of the most ruthless criminals on the East Coast. This wasn't about a runaway woman. This wasn't about a child. This was about him. They hadn't followed Grace here. They had been waiting for her to lead them to him. When he returned to the cottage, the sun was up. Grace was at the stove. She turned, and the question was in her eyes. "He was here," Sterling said, his voice grim. "He's not just some thug, Grace. He's part of something bigger, something from my past." He laid the notebook on the table. She stared at it, her face ashen. "What is your real name?" he demanded. "Not Grace. Your real name." She sank into a chair, her body trembling. "It's Catherine," she whispered. "Catherine Pembroke." "And what did you do for Alistair Finch?" he pressed, his voice hard. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I was his bookkeeper," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I saw everything. The real ledgers, the ones that could put his entire family away forever. I took them, and I ran." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with brutal force. She hadn't found him by accident. She had sought him out. The reclusive, disgraced prosecutor who had put her boss away. She wasn't looking for a hiding place. She was looking for a weapon, and he was it. The knock came at dawn. Not a furtive sound in the night, but a loud, authoritative banging on the main gate, a sound that demanded to be answered. Sterling was already there, standing on his porch, the shotgun held loosely in one hand. He wasn't surprised. He'd been waiting. The man from town, the one in the black hat, wasn't alone. There were two others with him, big men with dead eyes and the quiet confidence of hired muscle. The man in the hat held up a piece of paper. It looked official. It had a seal. "Sterling Hale!" he called out, his voice smooth and oily. "I have a warrant issued by a federal judge. We're here to apprehend a fugitive from justice, Catherine Pembroke. We have reason to believe you are harboring her on this property." Sterling's mind raced. A federal warrant? How? Finch's reach was longer and more powerful than he'd ever imagined. He had bought a judge. This wasn't just a manhunt anymore. This was a legal siege. "There's no one here by that name," Sterling called back, his voice steady. The man smiled, a cold, predatory slash across his face. "Oh, I think there is. Maybe she calls herself Grace now. We can do this the easy way, Hale, or we can do this the hard way. The warrant gives us the right to search every inch of this farm." This was the moment, the turning point. He could hand her over, let them take her and Willer. His life could go back to the quiet, empty peace he had cultivated. The ghosts would recede, or he could fight. He could burn down the fortress he had built to keep the world out, in order to protect the two people who had breached its walls. He looked back toward the cottage. The curtain moved. A small face peered out. Willer. Her eyes were wide with terror. In that instant, something inside Sterling Hale snapped. The farmer, the recluse, the man hiding from his past. He died. And the prosecutor, the fighter, the man who had once stared down monsters in a courtroom, was resurrected. "You're not setting foot on my property," Sterling said, his voice ringing with an authority the men hadn't expected. He raised the shotgun, not aiming it, but holding it as a statement. The man in the hat laughed. "You're one man, Hale, an old man playing soldier. You can't win." Suddenly, another voice cut through the tense morning air. A crisp, calm voice that Sterling knew well. "He is not alone, gentlemen." Mr. Carver stepped out onto the porch. He was holding a high-powered hunting rifle, and he held it with the practiced ease of a man who had used one for purposes other than shooting deer. His face was no longer the impassive mask of a butler. It was cold, hard, and lethal. The man in the hat stared, his smirk faltering. "Who the hell are you?" "I am the man," Carver said, his voice like chipping ice, "who handles Mr. Hale's security, and I am informing you that you are trespassing on private property. The warrant you hold is a fraudulent document obtained through bribery, and attempting to enforce it will be met with appropriate force." The thugs shifted nervously. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. They were bullies, not soldiers. They were here to intimidate a scared woman, not face down two men who looked like they were ready for a war. But the man in the hat was different. His eyes narrowed on Sterling. "This isn't over, Hale. Finch wants what she has, and he always gets what he wants." "Not this time," Sterling said. He took a step forward. "You tell Alistair Finch that Sterling Hale is back in the game, and I'm coming for him. I'm going to dismantle his entire empire piece by piece until there is nothing left but dust. You tell him I'm going to take everything he has, everyone he loves, and I will not stop until he is begging for the mercy he never gave anyone else." The words were a declaration of war, a promise of utter annihilation. The man in the hat stared at him, and for the first time, Sterling saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He had expected a broken-down recluse. He had found a demon. Without another word, the man and his thugs retreated, their confident swagger gone, replaced by a hurried, panicked scramble back to their vehicle. Sterling and Carver stood on the porch watching them go. The immediate threat was gone, but the war had just begun. He turned and looked at Carver. "You never told me you were an Army Ranger, 1st Battalion." Carver gave a small, rare smile. "You never asked, sir." Sterling walked back into the house, his mind already working, plotting, strategizing. He went to the study and unlocked a heavy, steel-lined trunk that had been gathering dust for years. Inside was his old life: files, contacts, a burn phone. He was no longer Sterling Hale, the orchard owner. He was the man Alistair Finch had feared most, the one man who had ever beaten him. Grace found him there, surrounded by papers. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands clasped in front of her. "What you said, did you mean it?" He looked up at her, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. "Every word," he said. "He came after my family. I'm going to bury him." He didn't say your family, he said my family. And in that moment, Grace, Catherine, knew that she had not run to a hiding place. She had run to the one man in the world who would not just fight her monster, but slay it. The battle for the orchard was over. The war for their souls had just begun. The next few weeks were a blur of calculated chaos. The Hale estate transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a war room. Sterling was a man possessed, resurrected from the ashes of his self-imposed exile. He worked with a relentless, terrifying focus that Grace had only seen in one other person: Alistair Finch. But where Finch's energy was born of greed and cruelty, Sterling's was forged from a cold, righteous fury. He was on the burn phone for hours at a time, his voice a low, commanding murmur as he called in favors from a life he thought he had abandoned. He spoke to federal marshals he'd trusted, investigative journalists he'd fed stories to, and shadowy financial analysts who owed him their careers. He was pulling the threads of Finch's empire from 1,000 miles away, and he was doing it with surgical precision. Carver, it turned out, was more than just a former ranger. He was a master of security, turning the estate into an impenetrable fortress. Motion sensors appeared in the trees. Infrared cameras monitored the perimeter. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the deadly preparations he was making. Grace, or Catherine as he now called her, was his partner in this war. She spent days with him in the study, her memory proving to be a weapon as potent as any gun. She recalled names, dates, and account numbers from the ledgers she had memorized, painting a vivid picture of Finch's criminal network. She was no longer a victim. She was a key witness, her testimony the bullet that would finally take the monster down. And Willer? Willer watched it all with her old, knowing eyes. She saw the change in Sterling, the new fire in his gaze. She saw the strength return to her mother's shoulders. She didn't understand the details of the war, but she understood its purpose. She started drawing again, but this time the pictures were different. She drew pictures of a lion standing guard over a cottage. She drew a big stone house with a shield over the door. One evening, Sterling found her on the porch steps, trying to fix a broken toy bird. Her small fingers fumbled with the delicate wooden wing. He sat down beside her, the weight of the world on his shoulders, and took the bird from her hands. He pulled a small pocket knife from his coat and with a few deft movements, carved a tiny peg to fix the wing. "How do you know how to fix everything?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Sterling looked out at the orchard, the trees standing like silent soldiers in the twilight. "I don't," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I just know that if something is broken, you don't throw it away. You fight for it." He handed the bird back to her. She looked at it, then up at him, and for the first time since she had arrived at his gate, she smiled. A real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. That smile was the reason for this war. It was the flag he was fighting under. The end game came faster than any of them expected. One of Sterling's contacts, a deputy director in the Department of Justice, called him on the secure line. "We've got him, Sterling," the man said. "The information from your witness was the final nail. We're moving on all of Finch's properties at 0600 tomorrow. It's over." A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over Sterling. He hung up the phone and just stood there for a moment, the silence of the study pressing in on him. He had done it. He had won. He found Catherine in the kitchen, kneading dough with a fierce intensity. He walked up behind her and gently placed his hands on her shoulders. She flinched, then relaxed as she realized it was him. "It's over," he said softly. "They're taking him down in the morning." She stopped kneading, her hands covered in flour. She turned to face him, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. She didn't speak. She just launched herself into his arms, her body shaking with sobs that had been held back for years. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, letting her finally release the fear and the pain she had carried for so long. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, two broken people who had found a way to heal each other, as the smell of baking bread filled the air. The next morning, the sun rose on a different world. The news was everywhere. The empire of Alistair Finch had crumbled overnight. Arrests were made across the country. His assets were frozen. His power was broken. The monster was finally in a cage. A strange, unfamiliar peace settled over the estate. The motion sensors were taken down. Carver went back to complaining about potpourri, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy with dread. It felt calm. That afternoon, Sterling was walking the fence line, a habit he couldn't break, when Catherine and Willer found him. Willer ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the trees as she chased a butterfly. Catherine walked beside him, her steps light, her face free from the shadows that had haunted it for so long. "I don't know how to thank you, Sterling," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, at the woman who had crashed into his life and forced him to become the man he was always meant to be. "You don't have to," he said. "You and Willer, you saved me. I was a ghost in this house. You brought it back to life." They reached the top of a small ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The orchard spread out below them, a tapestry of green and gold. In the distance, the main house stood like a silent guardian. "I was thinking," Sterling said, his voice hesitant. "This spot, it has the best view. The sun hits it just right in the morning. We could build something here, a new house, something smaller, something for us." Catherine stared at him, her heart swelling in her chest. A home. Not a hiding place, not a fortress, a home. She looked at Willer, who was now sitting in a patch of wildflowers, weaving them into a crown. She looked at this man, this gruff, broken, beautiful man who had fought a war for them. She slipped her hand into his. It felt right. It felt like coming home. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I'd like that." It wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning. The past would always be a part of them, a map of scars that showed where they had been. But now, for the first time, they had a future. A future they would build together, one plank, one nail, one day at a time, under the watchful eyes of the orchard. If you enjoyed this story of justice, redemption, and the family we choose, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that remind us that even in the darkest of nights, the sun will eventually rise. And let me know in the comments, what do you think is the first thing they'll plant in the garden of their new home?